shadows of history, where the wind still carries the screams of the forgotten. This is Atlas of the Forgotten, where we uncover the stories buried in blood and silence. If you believe the past still has secrets waiting to be exposed, subscribe. Now press the like button and step with me into the darkness. Because today, we travel to the Caribbean, where a slave built the wood that would carry a man to his death. And that man was his master. The sun over St. Lucia in the year 1768 did not shine gently. It burned like punishment, and the plantation of Elias Whitmore stood on a hill, like a throne built on bones. Sugar-cane fields stretched wide and green, hiding scars beneath their beauty. And in those fields, men and women worked until their skin cracked and their backs split open under the whip. And among them was a man named Josiah, a carpenter, not by choice but by skill. His hands were steady, his eyes sharp, and his silence deeper than the ocean. He had been taken from the Gold Coast as a boy, chained in the belly of a ship, where men died in darkness. And when he arrived in the Caribbean, he was sold not to the fields, but to the workshop, because even in chains, talent has value to cruel men. Elias Whitmore liked to boast that he owned the finest sugar mill on the island, and the finest slave carpenter as well. Josiah built doors that locked other men inside. He built wagons that carried sugar soaked in sweat. He built whipping posts. He built cages, and every nail he hammered was a reminder that his own hands were strengthening the machine that crushed his people. Whitmore trusted him more than the others, a dangerous gift on a plantation. Trust did not mean respect. It meant usefulness, and usefulness meant you were kept alive just long enough to be broken. Slowly, Josiah watched everything he saw: how Whitmore drank rum at dusk and counted coins while children cried in the huts. He saw how Whitmore's son Thomas learned cruelty like it was a family trade, laughing as he forced slaves to fight each other for sport. He saw how the mistress Clara pretended not to see the bruises on the house girls. And Josiah said nothing, because a carpenter survives by listening more than speaking. But silence is not surrender. Silence can be planning. One night, a young field hand named Samuel tried to run. He did not make it far. Dogs found him in the mangroves, and Whitmore ordered an example to be made. The slaves were forced to gather at dawn. Josiah stood among them as Whitmore announced that a gallows would be built at the edge of the field so every man and woman could see what freedom costs. Then Whitmore turned to Josiah and said, "Build it strong, make it tall. I want them to see him." From every corner of my land and the field went silent, because the carpenter was being ordered to build death for one of his own, and Josiah bowed his head, not in obedience, but to hide the storm in his eyes that night. He did not sleep. He sat in his small hut and stared at his hands. These hands had built cages. Now they would build a rope's embrace. But something inside him shifted like a door, unlocking in darkness. The next morning, he began measuring wood, choosing beams from the strongest of my iron, stacked near the mill. Whitmore watched, pleased by the efficiency. The gallows rose quickly, taller than necessary, solid, like a monument. And as Josiah worked, he calculated weight angles, tension. He understood wood better than any white man on that island. He knew how it split, how it held, how it betrayed. And he made subtle changes, not visible to the untrained eye. He reinforced parts that would carry greater strain. He adjusted the trap mechanism. He measured the beam twice, then shaved it slightly thinner, in a place no one would inspect, too small to notice, too precise to ignore later. And when Whitmore asked why it was built so strong, Josiah replied, "A weak platform dishonors the lesson, sir." And Whitmore laughed, believing loyalty when what stood before him was patience sharpening itself. Samuel was hanged at noon. His body swung beneath the Caribbean sun, and the slaves were forced to. Watch Josiah did not look at Samuel's face. He looked at the gallows, memorizing every sound, every creak, Every sway because wood speaks, and he was listening. Days passed, then weeks. The gallows remained standing a warning shadow across the field. Whitmore began using it more often. Small rebellions, petty theft exhaustion, mistaken for defiance. And each time Josiah was ordered to inspect it. And each time he adjusted something tiny, something almost invisible. He loosened a peg here, reinforced a hinge there, preparing not for the hanging of slaves, but for something far greater. Whispers began spreading through the quarters. Josiah did not start them, but he did not silence them. Either men spoke of fire. Women spoke of poison. Old ones spoke of spirits angry at the land. Samuel's death had cracked something open, and Whitmore sensed it. He grew harsher, ordered more beatings, drank more rum. Paranoia sat heavy on him, like humidity. And one evening, after punishing a pregnant woman for collapsing in the field, Whitmore announced another execution, this time 2 men accused of plotting revolt. He demanded the entire plantation gather again, and he ordered Josiah to test the trap personally, stand on it. He said, "Prove it holds." Josiah stepped onto the platform, feeling the wood beneath his bare feet. He knew every inch of it like it was part of his own body. Whitmore pulled the lever as a joke. The trap dropped slightly, then caught. As designed, the crowd gasped. Whitmore roared with laughter. "See," he shouted, "even my carpenter trusts my justice." And Josiah climbed down slowly, hiding the truth the trap had not caught. By accident, it had caught. Because he wanted Whitmore to believe in it. The rebellion did not begin with shouting. It began with silence one night, under a moon hidden by clouds. Josiah walked to the workshop and gathered tools. Axes as saws nails, not to build but to break. He moved like a shadow to the quarters where Samuel's brother waited, with others, strong men tired of bending women who had buried too many children. Josiah told them, tomorrow Whitmore will hang the 2 men, and he will stand on that platform to prove his power when he does. Do not move until I move, do not shout until I shout, because revenge is not fire. It is structure, and structure must hold. Morning came thick and heavy. The 2 accused men were dragged forward. Whitmore climbed the gallows first, boasting to his guests from a neighboring estate that he ruled with discipline. He stamped his boot on the wood to show its strength, and ordered Josiah to prepare the nooses. As Josiah stepped up beside him, he felt the eyes of the entire plantation watching. Whitmore leaned close and whispered, "You build well for a savage," and in that moment, something ancient and cold settled inside Josiah. He reached for the lever, not the main lever, but the secondary support peg he had carved thinner weeks ago, and with a single, precise motion, he knocked it free. The sound was small, almost gentle, but wood remembers its maker. The beam shifted, weight transferred where it was never meant to, and the reinforced hinge beneath Whitmore's boots gave way. The platform split, not completely, not enough to collapse under 2 men, but enough when one heavy man stood at the edge boasting. And suddenly Whitmore's footing vanished. The master who ordered hangings felt air beneath him. The rope meant for another tightened around his own neck, because Josiah had measured everything, even the length and the drop. Chaos exploded, screams, gunshots, dust rising, but it happened too fast. Whitmore's body jerked once, then hung still. The guests froze, unable to understand what they were seeing. Thomas reached for a pistol, but Samuel's brother swung an axe, and the plantation erupted into violence. The slaves did not hesitate. Now they moved like a tide, breaking gates, setting fire to cane fields, years of rage finding voice in flame. Clara fled toward the house, but was stopped by house servants, who no longer bowed. Josiah stood beneath the gallows, looking up at the man who believed wood obeyed only him. And for the first time since the ship from Africa, he felt the weight in his chest lift, not because revenge heals, but because justice had finally taken shape. The rebellion lasted 3 days. Militia. Forces arrived from neighboring estates, muskets and horses crushing what remained. Many slaves were killed, others captured, but Josiah was not found. Some said he fled into the mountains, joining Maroons who lived free beyond Plantation reach. Others said he sailed away on a stolen fishing boat under cover of smoke. Some whispered that he let himself be taken and never revealed his name, choosing silence again as his final weapon. The gallows was torn down, burned to ash, but the story spread across the island of a carpenter who built too well of a master who trusted wood more than men, and of the morning when the platform meant to display fear displayed something else entirely, and even now in the Caribbean, where sugar once grew thick and red, old people speak softly of structures and power, and how sometimes the hands forced to build oppression are the same hands that understand exactly how to make it fall. The smoke from the burning cane fields did not rise like ordinary smoke. It moved heavy and slow, as if the island itself was exhaling centuries of grief, and the air tasted of ash and gunpowder, and something deeper, something that felt like the breaking of chains, even though iron still clung to many wrists and ankles. The militia rode through the plantation, with their horses snorting in panic at the smell of fire, their boots crushing embers under iron heels, and they shot anything that moved without asking names, because on plantations, names did not matter. Only ownership mattered, and ownership had just swung lifeless from a rope built by a slave carpenter. The body of Elias Whitmore was cut down before sunset, not out of mercy, but because the sight of him hanging was more dangerous than the rebellion itself. A dead master could inspire ideas, and ideas were more feared than machetes. Thomas Whitmore survived the first rush of violence, though blood ran down his face from a cut above his eye, and humiliation burned hotter than the fire devouring the sugar mill. He screamed orders that no one obeyed, and when the militia captain demanded to know who was responsible, all fingers eventually pointed toward one name: Josiah the carpenter, the silent one, the trusted one, the man who built the gallows too strong and yet somehow too weak. And Thomas swore before the captain that he would skin the man alive and hang him piece by piece if he were found. But even as the threat left his mouth, doubt entered his eyes, because deep inside he understood something terrible. He had never really known the man who built his world. He had only owned his labor, and labor without understanding is a blindfold. The search began before the flames died. Dogs were brought from a neighboring estate. Men combed the mangroves, the shoreline, the thick forest beyond the fields. Josiah had prepared for more than one ending weeks before the rebellion. He had repaired a small fishing canoe under the excuse of patching it for plantation use. He had hidden dried cassava inside a hollow beam in the workshop. He had memorized the tide patterns like a prayer, and on the morning of the revolt, while chaos swallowed attention, he had slipped away, not running, not rushing, but walking calmly toward the coast with smoke. As his curtain, some said they saw him push the canoe into the water alone. Some swore he vanished into the hills, guided by Maroons who had long watched the plantation. From shadows, others believed he never intended to escape at all, that he blended into the captured crowd, allowing chains to close around him again, because survival is not always freedom. And sometimes freedom is knowing you have already broken the thing that enslaved you. Days turned into weeks, and the plantation stood scarred. The mill roof collapsed, the cane fields black and brittle, the big house stripped of silver and dignity. Clara Whitmore left the island within a month, her face pale as salt. Refusing to speak of what happened, Thomas remained. But he was not the same. He ordered a new gallows built immediately larger than before, but no carpenter on the island wanted the task. White craftsmen demanded double pay, and still worked with trembling hands because wood had become something else. Now it was no longer only material, it was possibility. The new structure rose awkward and uneven, and every creak it made in the wind felt like mockery. Thomas ordered 3 men hanged within the first week on that new platform, trying to drown fear with blood. But the executions did not restore order. They deepened resentment, and stories of Josiah spread faster than ships. On neighboring islands, whispers carried his legend across docks and taverns. They called him the Carpenter of Judgment, the man who measured death. Some claimed he had once been the son of a village builder in Africa, taught to respect trees as living spirits, and that when he carved the gallows, he whispered to the wood, asking it to remember justice. Others said he studied Whitmore for years, not out of obedience, but like a hunter studies prey, noting his weight, his habits, the way he liked to stand at the edge of platforms, when speaking to crowds as if he needed to feel height, to believe in power, and whether truth or myth, the effect was the same. Planters grew suspicious of skilled slaves. Suddenly intelligence looked like danger. Literacy felt like a blade hidden in cloth. And carpenters, blacksmiths, coopers were watched more closely than ever because knowledge was no longer seen as useful alone. It was seen as explosive. Meanwhile, on the hills above St. Lucia, Maroon camps tightened security. They heard of the rebellion and expected retaliation. Patrols and increased traps were set along narrow forest paths, and one evening, as the sun bled red into the sea, a figure approached slowly unarmed, carrying only a small wooden tool wrapped in cloth. The sentries aimed bows ready to release, but the figure stopped, raised empty hands, and spoke in a calm voice, telling them he had built something once, and now he wished to build nothing for masters ever again. When they brought him into the camp and unwrapped the cloth, they found a carving simple yet powerful. It was a small wooden beam split clean through, with a noose hanging from its own break, and the men in the camp exchanged looks, because this was not random art. It was confession and claim. And from that night, stories say a man named Josiah lived among them, teaching younger runaways how to construct huts that could be dismantled quickly, how to reinforce lookout towers, how to weaken bridges used by militia without leaving obvious marks. He never bragged, he never raised his voice, but he taught them that structure decides survival. Back on the plantation, Thomas Whitmore's obsession grew. He paid informants across the island promising freedom to any slave who delivered Josiah alive. Betrayal became currency, and suspicion poisoned relationships within quarters on every estate. Some men were beaten merely because they had once worked with wood. Some women were whipped because they had spoken the carpenter's name with admiration. Fear twisted into cruelty, and cruelty only sharpened resolve. Smaller revolts began sparking across St. Lucia. Cane fields burned at night. Storage barns collapsed. Mysteriously, sugar shipments were delayed because carts lost wheels at critical moments, and no one could prove sabotage. Yet the pattern was clear. The island itself seemed to be resisting. And in the mind of Thomas Whitmore, one truth screamed louder than reason. This is his work he is still building. Years passed, but the story did not fade. It changed shape. Sometimes Josiah was said to have sailed to Haiti and joined early rumblings of what would later become the Haitian Revolution. Sometimes he was believed to have died quietly in the mountains, old and free, his hands finally building homes instead of gallows. And there were darker rumors, too, whispers that he allowed himself to be captured, eventually standing silent before a military court, refusing to deny or confess. And when asked why he betrayed his master, he answered simply, "I built what he asked and what he deserved, but no records confirm this. The plantation ledgers list damaged property, lost slaves, executed rebels, but no clear entry marks the fate of the carpenter." And perhaps that is fitting, because some men are larger as shadows than as statistics. What remains undeniable is that the Gallows incident shifted something permanent. Planters began limiting how much authority skilled slaves held. They split work crews more carefully. They avoided letting one man oversee an entire structure. Paranoia seeped into daily operations because trust once broken cannot be nailed back together seamlessly, and in taverns across the Caribbean, white men drank heavily, telling each other that it was a rare accident, a structural flaw, an unfortunate slip. But when they returned home and stepped onto balconies or platforms, many paused for a fraction of a second, feeling the wood beneath their boots, testing its strength with cautious pressure. And in that hesitation lay Josiah's lasting revenge, not just the death of one cruel master, but the birth of doubt in every man who believed ownership guaranteed safety. And in the quarters at night, when elders spoke to children about survival, they told them, learn everything you can learn, watch closely, even when forced to bow, understand how things are built, because power often hides in structure. And if you ever must bring something down, do not rush, do not shout, measure twice, cut once, and let the weight of injustice pull itself apart. And somewhere in the rhythm of waves hitting Caribbean shores, in the creak of wooden docks, and the groan of ships loaded with sugar, there is an echo of a beam giving way under the weight of arrogance, a reminder that the hands forced to build oppression may one day design its end. And that is why this story lives, because it is not only about revenge, it is about intelligence, patience, and the quiet, terrifying truth that the oppressed sometimes know the system better than the men who rule it. Thomas Whitmore never escaped the shadow of the beam, even years after his father's burial. The image returned to him at night, not as a dream, but as sound, a sharp crack of wood splitting under weight, followed by the choking snap of rope tightening, and he would wake, sweating, clawing at his throat, though no rope touched him, and in daylight he tried to bury fear and authority. He doubled patrols, increased punishments, and imported new slaves from Barbados, convinced that unfamiliar faces meant fewer conspiracies. But oppression is not erased by replacement. It is repeated, and every new arrival carried stories of the carpenter who measured death, and those stories traveled faster than chains could silence them. The new slaves listened wide-eyed in the quarters, hearing how one man used skill instead of brute force, how patience defeated pride, and something dangerous grew, not loud, not wild, but steady like a heartbeat under soil. The plantation economy struggled. Sugar production dropped. Investors questioned Thomas's competence. Merchants demanded repayment for burned shipments, and whispers began in colonial offices that perhaps the Whitmore estate was cursed, not by spirits, but by arrogance. And Thomas responded as weak rulers often do. He sought spectacle. He announced a grand rebuilding, a larger mill, a stronger main house, and most important, a towering gallows built of imported oak from England wood he believed too foreign to betray him. He hired a white carpenter from Martinique named Henri Duval, paying him heavily and warning him daily that no slave was to touch the structure. Duval noticed the fear in Thomas's eyes and asked once what happened to the old gallows, and Thomas replied it failed. And when Duval pressed how Thomas snapped, wood does not fail, men fail. And Duval wisely said nothing more, but as he worked, he felt the tension in the air and understood that this was not just construction, it was therapy for a haunted master. Meanwhile, high in the forest, the Maroon settlement expanded under careful guidance. Josiah never declared himself leader, yet influence settled on him naturally. Because he understood more than survival, he understood systems. He taught them how plantations calculated profit, how shipping seasons worked when patrols were weakest, and how fear spreads through rumor. He carved small models of mills and houses, showing young fighters where structural weaknesses lay. He explained how a single missing support beam could collapse a roof during heavy rain, how cutting drainage channels could flood, cane fields ruining harvest without direct confrontation, and the Maroons began conducting raids, not reckless, but surgical storehouses, rotted carts, snapped wells filled with debris, and always the damage looked like accident-like, weather-like, poor design, and Thomas Whitmore's frustration deepened because he could not hang weather, he could not whip decay. One humid evening, a captured runaway was dragged before Thomas. Claiming knowledge in exchange for mercy, the man trembled as he spoke, saying he had seen a carpenter in the mountains, a quiet man teaching others to build and break. And Thomas leaned forward, gripping the arms of his chair, demanding proof, demanding direction, demanding certainty. But the runaway only knew fragments. A river bent a rock shaped like a skull, a path marked by carved symbols, and Thomas seized the chance, organizing an armed expedition into the forest, determined to end the legend once and for all. They marched at dawn, boots, heavy guns loaded, guided by fear disguised as courage, and deep in the hills they found signs of habitation, abandoned huts, extinguished fires. Footprints fading, intentionally confusing the militia, followed for hours, growing tired, sweating through uniforms, until suddenly one of their own fell through a concealed pit, snapping his leg on sharpened stakes, and panic rippled through the line. Then another man screamed as a rope trap yanked him upside down, musket clattering to the ground, and from the trees arrows flew, not to kill all, but to scatter, to disorient. And in the chaos, Thomas shouted for formation, but formation requires clarity, and clarity had been stolen by terrain designed by minds that understood structure better than he ever would. The militia retreated, bruised, humiliated, and furious, and though they burned what little they found, the core of the Maroon camp remained untouched, because it had already shifted, relocated quietly under Josiah's instruction. He never underestimated retaliation. He moved before it arrived, and among his people he spoke rarely of revenge. Now he spoke of endurance, telling them, one fallen master changes little. If the system stands, he encouraged alliances with other Maroon groups, trading knowledge for food, coordinating signals across hills using drum patterns coded differently from plantation rhythms, and slowly resistance transformed from isolated sparks into a network invisible yet present. Thomas sensed this, but could not grasp it. His world was built on visible control, on counting bodies and barrels, not on measuring unseen connections, and this ignorance became his cage. Years layered over the island like sediment storms came and went. Governors changed policies. Sugar prices rose and fell, but the legend persisted. Sailors carried it to Trinidad, to Dominica, to Jamaica, embellishing details, adding fire where there was smoke, claiming the carpenter spoke to wood and commanded beams to obey justice. Some planters laughed publicly, dismissing it as slave fantasy. Yet privately they altered behavior, limiting how much autonomy skilled slaves possessed, restricting gatherings, avoiding public speeches on raised platforms, because no one wanted to stand too proudly above a crowd that might be measuring weight and angle. And in that subtle behavioral shift, Josiah's impact lived, not carved in stone, not recorded in official archives, but embedded in posture, in hesitation, in the small instinctive test of boards before stepping fully onto them. Thomas Whitmore aged faster than expected, paranoia carving lines into his face deeper than sun ever could. He trusted no one, not overseers, not house servants, not even Duval, the imported carpenter, whose work he inspected, obsessively tapping beams, demanding reinforcement in places that did not require it, and Duval eventually left the island unwilling to serve a man at war with wood alone in his office. Thomas would stare at architectural drawings late into the night, searching for betrayal within lines and measurements, as if somewhere hidden was a secret formula that could guarantee loyalty, but loyalty cannot be engineered through fear, and fear cannot be entirely engineered out of memory. The plantation survived financially, yet spiritually it rotted. Workers moved mechanically, eyes dull, but minds alert, because every oppressive system teaches the oppressed intimately how it functions, and that knowledge, once awakened, cannot be erased. As for Josiah, some accounts claim he grew older in the mountains, hair-graying hands still steady, teaching children born free among trees how to carve and measure, not for gallows, but for bridges, watchtowers, storage huts, and even small boats capable of quiet coastal travel. Others say he eventually sailed to a larger island where revolution brewed openly, lending his understanding to battles that would ignite history. But what remains constant across every whisper is not where he died, but how he lived, patient, observant, calculating, not consumed by rage, but guided by it, refined into precision. And in the end, perhaps, that is the truest revenge, not the single moment of a beam cracking beneath a cruel man's weight, but the lasting infection of doubt planted in every tyrant who stands on elevated ground, believing himself untouchable, because somewhere beneath his boots could be wood shaped by hands that remember every injustice and know exactly where to carve the weakness. And that is why the story endures across the Caribbean, carried by wind and tide and quiet voices at night, because it reminds the forgotten that intelligence's power structure can be weapon, and even in chains the mind remains free enough to design the fall of giants. And if you listen closely when you step onto old wooden boards and hear them creak, you might wonder who built them and what they measured while pretending to obey. Long after Thomas Whitmore's hair turned white and his hands began to tremble, the island itself seemed to watch him differently. The workers no longer lowered their eyes as quickly. And though chains still clinked in the fields, there was a calmness behind many faces, a calmness that frightened him more than open anger, because anger can be crushed, but calm patience cannot be easily broken. He ordered new laws on his estate, forbidding slaves from practicing skilled trades without direct supervision. He split families to prevent loyalty forming too strong. He rotated labor crews weekly, so no group could bond long enough to whisper plans. Yet every measure he took felt like patching a leaking roof during a hurricane, because the storm was not outside anymore. It lived in his thoughts, in the memory of that single measured cut that changed everything. He began refusing to stand on balconies, and when guests visited, he kept both feet planted firmly on solid stone floors, and some noticed his reluctance, and rumors began again. Not about Josiah this time, but about the master who feared wood. Across the Caribbean, winds of change were stirring empires, shifted alliances, wars between European powers, weakened colonial grip, and enslaved populations listened carefully to news carried by sailors and traders. Each rumor of conflict meant opportunity, and in hidden camps, Maroons expanded their reach, building quiet alliances with discontented slaves on plantations, exchanging coded messages through songs and market conversations. And in every one of those exchanges, the philosophy Josiah taught remained central. Understand the structure before you strike. Learn the habits of those who rule you, measure their strength, and find its weakest join, and never waste motion on anger alone, because anger without design collapses like rotten timber. And the younger fighters who grew under his guidance began surpassing him in speed and boldness, not reckless, but efficient. They sabotaged supply routes, intercepted messengers, and freed small groups of captives without drawing full retaliation. and the island authorities struggled to respond because they fought shadows shaped by knowledge, not chaos. Thomas, in his later years, attempted one final act of dominance. He commissioned a massive stone platform in the center of the estate, claiming stone could not betray him like wood, and the construction took months under armed watch slaves cut and carried heavy blocks sweating under the tropical sun. And when it was completed, Thomas stood upon it during a public address, declaring that fear would rule his land again, that rebellion had been crushed, that no carpenter, no runaway, no mountain ghost could threaten his authority, and the crowd listened, silent faces unreadable. And though the platform did not crack beneath him, something else shifted, because stone may not split like timber, but pride built on oppression erodes from within. And even as he spoke, distant drums echoed faintly from the hills, not loud, not defiant, just present. And Thomas faltered mid-sentence, realizing that the sound did not signal attack. It signaled existence. The Maroons was still there, still watching, still free, and his words dissolved into humidity. When Thomas Whitmore finally died, it was not by rope or blade, but by fever, alone in his bed. Delirious in his final hours, Sir claimed he muttered about measurements and beams, about balance and weight, about eyes watching from forests. And when he was buried, no grand gallows marked the land anymore. Only overgrown fields and a stone platform cracked at one corner from years of rain erosion and neglect, because even stone yields to time, and the estate slowly passed into other hands. Ownership, changing names, but never fully erasing the stain of its history, yet the legend of the carpenter outlived them all. Others whispered it to children as warning and inspiration. Planters spoke it reluctantly as caution, and sailors exaggerated it into myth across ports and islands, and each telling one truth endured, that a man once forced to build tools of terror studied them so deeply he transformed knowledge into liberation. Generations later, when abolition finally swept through the Caribbean like a long-delayed tide washing chains from wrists, descendants of slaves and masters alike walked the same soil differently. Some searching for graves, some searching for proof, some searching for peace, and among ruins of old estates, archaeologists found remnants of charred beams buried under layers of earth fragments, of a gallows long destroyed. And though records never confirmed the exact details, the oral histories aligned too closely to ignore there had been a carpenter. There had been a hanging. There had been a moment when structure obeyed justice instead of cruelty, and perhaps that is the most powerful part of the story. Not whether every detail survives, but that memory itself became resistance, shaping identity, shaping caution, shaping courage, because systems of oppression depend on forgetfulness, and the Caribbean did not forget data today. When visitors walk through preserved plantation sites, guided by rehearsed narratives about sugar wealth and colonial architecture, few are told about the carpenter who measured revenge with precision. Few plaques mention how intelligence moved quietly beneath forced labor, yet in communities where ancestors carried chains, the story remains alive, not as simple vengeance, but as lesson. Learn the tools, understand the framework. Never underestimate patience, and never assume the powerful truly grasp the systems they command, because somewhere within beams and bolts, within ledgers and laws, within routines repeated without thought, lies a point of weakness waiting for steady hands to find it. And that is why this tale belongs in the Atlas of the Forgotten. Not because it glorifies death, but because it reveals the hidden geometry of resistance, the silent calculations behind survival, and the truth that even in the darkest centuries, under the harshest sun, brilliance endured, waiting for the right moment to shift the weight of history with one deliberate cut. And if you listen closely to the past, you will hear it Not shouting, but measuring, always measuring, waiting for arrogance to step exactly where it should not. And when it does, the structure will answer accordingly. And even after freedom was written into law, ink drying on documents signed by men who once profited from chains, the deeper architecture of power did not vanish overnight. Plantations changed names, overseers became managers, wages replaced whips, but inequality settled into new forms like old foundations reused for different buildings and in villages carved out of former estates. Elders still pointed toward hills where Maroons once lived, telling children that freedom was not gifted. It was engineered, and among those stories. The carpenter remained a quiet center, not worshipped, not exaggerated into a god, but remembered as proof that the mind can remain unchained even when the body is owned. Scholars who later studied resistance movements across the Caribbean noticed patterns sabotaged through structural weakness, coordinated silence before revolt, targeted destruction, rather than blind rage, and though no official document credited a single man, oral tradition often referenced an unnamed builder whose methods spread island to island like blueprints carried in memory rather than paper. In St. Lucia, the Whitmore estate eventually fractured into smaller plots, sold to merchants and freed families. The grand stone platform Thomas once trusted crumbled slowly, rainwater seeping into cracks, weeds pushing through stubborn lines, until one season a heavy storm split it clean down the middle. Villagers who witnessed it fall felt no shock, only a quiet sense of balance restored, because what is built on fear cannot outlast time. And some said as the stone cracked, they heard a sound like distant wood snapping, though no timber stood nearby. And whether imagination or echo, it reinforced what they already believed, that history itself remembers tension and releases it when ready. Descendants of the enslaved carpenters, blacksmiths, masons across the region continued practicing trades with pride, reclaiming skills once exploited for oppression, turning them toward homes, schools, churches. Boats, enterprises built not to confine but to sustain. And in workshops where sawdust floated in warm light, older craftsmen sometimes paused before making a critical cut, telling apprentices measure twice cut once and understand what your hands truly serve, because every structure carries intention, and intention shapes outcome. And though they rarely named him directly, the philosophy traced back to that singular act on a sunburned morning in 1768, when a beam gave way under the weight it was never meant to honor. Travelers who came centuries later searching archives for proof often left frustrated. Plantation records focused on profit, not justice. Execution logs listed numbers, not motives. Militia reports described rebellion without introspection, and Josiah's name, if that was even his true name, appeared nowhere in ink. But absence in official record does not equal absence in truth. Some stories survive precisely because they threatened those who kept books, and the Caribbean has always preserved its deepest realities in voice and rhythm, in coded song rather than parchment. And so the carpenter lives there in cadence and proverb, in warning, shared between generations, that skill without awareness can strengthen chains, but skill guided by patience can dismantle them. If you stand today at the edge of a former cane field and close your eyes, you may imagine the heat and the sting of sweat, the distant creak of rope and wood, and beyond that, the quieter sound of thought forming strategy beneath forced obedience, because the true thriller was never only the moment of execution. It was the years of observation, the calculations made while appearing submissive, the courage required to wait until precision guaranteed impact. That is where the intensity truly lives, in restraint, in discipline, in the refusal to waste opportunity. And that is why tyrants fear thinkers more than fighters, because a fighter confronts strength directly, but a thinker studies it, maps it, measures it, and chooses the exact point where gravity will do the rest. And so the story does not end with a hanging or a deathbed fever. It continues in every act of deliberate resistance against injustice in every system, quietly examined for weakness in every oppressed mind that refuses to accept the permanence of its condition. The carpenter's greatest creation was not a gallows. It was doubt planted in the architecture of domination. Doubt that spread beyond one plantation, beyond one island, beyond one century. And doubt once rooted cannot be easily uprooted because it changes how power stands, how it speaks, how it steps onto any elevated ground, forever wondering if beneath the surface unseen hands once measured the load and found it wanting, and that lingering uncertainty, that invisible tension in the beams of authority, may be the most enduring revenge of all, and that is why this story must be told and retold in shadows and in light, because forgetting would rebuild what was already broken, and remembering keeps every structure honest under the weight it carries. Time moved forward, but the island never truly forgot, and in the quiet years that followed emancipation, when former slaves tried to build lives from land that had once swallowed their sweat, the legend of the carpenter shifted again. It was no longer only a story of revenge. It became a lesson in design. Elders would gather young men beneath trees at dusk and speak not of rage, but of awareness. They would say, "Study the world around you. Understand who benefits from your labor. Understand how wealth is built and how control is maintained. Because the man who knows how something stands also knows how it can fall." And in that teaching, the memory of the gallows transformed from a weapon into wisdom. Merchants who later purchased parts of the Whitmore land discovered that rebuilding trust was harder than rebuilding structures. Laborers worked, but never blindly. They questioned contracts. They measured fairness. They negotiated wages, and though they lacked formal education, many possessed sharp insight passed down through stories disguised as folklore. And more than once, a landowner attempting to cheat workers found his storage mysteriously damaged or his supply routes quietly interrupted, not through wild revolt, but through calculated disruption, and observers began writing in private journals that Caribbean laborers possessed unusual organizational instinct. They seemed to understand logistics, timing coordination, as if rebellion had been studied like mathematics, and perhaps in some hidden way it had. Across the wider region, revolutions and uprisings reshaped colonial power. The Haitian Revolution proved that enslaved people could overthrow empires, and news of that triumph electrified islands where fear had once ruled absolutely, and in those discussions, some referenced earlier sparks, lesser-known acts that chipped away at the illusion of invincibility, including the morning when a master trusted his own gallows too much. Historians may debate specifics, but psychologically, the impact was undeniable. Planters who once believed control was natural now sensed vulnerability, and vulnerability changes behavior. It forces caution. It reduces arrogance. It plants hesitation, and hesitation slows oppression, even when it does not immediately end it. There were songs sung quietly in fishing villages about a builder who carved justice from timber lyrics, simple but layered, describing a man who listened to trees, who measured silence, who waited until pride leaned too far. And though the names changed in each version, the essence remained consistent: patience, precision, consequence. And children who heard these songs did not always grasp their depth until years later, when facing unfair systems of their own. And then suddenly, the story returned to them not as myth, but as method. Some modern scholars exploring resistance theory argue that the most effective revolts combine emotional drive with structural understanding. Spontaneous anger may ignite a flame, but sustained change requires blueprint awareness. And in that framework, the carpenter stands as archetype, a figure representing strategic rebellion rather than chaotic violence. His act did not free the island overnight, but it fractured psychological dominance. It revealed that mastery over bodies did not equal mastery over knowledge, and once that truth surfaced, it could not be entirely buried again. Tourists today may photograph ruins without sensing the tension. Once thick in the air, they may admire colonial architecture, unaware that enslaved minds memorized every beam, every joint, every support, calculating under watchful eyes. But for descendants whose bloodlines trace back to those fields, the land feels different. There is memory embedded in soil and breeze, in the subtle creak of old docks. And when community leaders speak about empowerment, education, self-sufficiency, they echo the same underlying principle. Understand systems deeply and use that. Understanding ethically to protect dignity and opportunity. The thriller element of the carpenter's story lies not only in the split second when wood gave way, but in the years leading to that instant, the discipline required to endure humiliation without surrendering intellect, the courage to risk everything on a single, calculated move. The awareness that success depended not on brute strength, but on exact measurement. And in that sense, his life becomes a metaphor for countless unnamed individuals who resisted through subtle acts, sabotage of machinery, misdirection of information, preservation of culture, quiet coordination beneath the surface of oppression. Even in modern times, structures still exist that concentrate power unfairly. And though gallows are no longer central symbols, other platforms remain economic, legal, social, and the lesson carries forward: analyze before acting, measure before cutting. Choose moments carefully, because systems often collapse under their own imbalance when pressure is applied precisely at stress points. This is not merely historical reflection. It is strategic insight born from survival. And perhaps somewhere metaphorically, the carpenter continues walking through history, appearing whenever injustice builds itself too confidently, standing silently near beams and foundations, examining joints, tracing weight lines, waiting not with hatred, but with clarity, because the ultimate message is not destruction. For its own sake, it is accountability. It is balance. It is the reminder that no structure built on suffering stands forever, without consequence. Gravity exists in moral dimensions as surely as in physical ones. And when imbalance grows, extreme correction becomes inevitable. Sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, but always according to forces set in motion long before. So the story endures, not because it is comfortable, but because it is instructive. It warns the powerful against arrogance and encourages the oppressed toward thoughtful resistance. It honors intelligence, sharpened by hardship, and patience stronger than chains. And as long as systems are built by human hands, there will always be those who study them from below, learning their strengths and weaknesses, preparing quietly for the moment when history shifts weight once more. And when that shift comes, it will echo faintly like wood under strain, reminding us that somewhere in the past, a carpenter once proved that understanding the framework is the first step toward transforming it, and that truth remains alive wherever people refuse to forget how power is constructed and how carefully it must be measured before it falls. Thanks for watching Atlas of the Forgotten. Stay tuned. We will bring you more lost stories.